So, as a generalization, Europeans established colonies in America to make money. Exactly how the colony functioned depended really on what country was ruling and what the primary purpose of the colony was. So far in the course, we've seen lots of examples of conquest, and often when a new power comes in and takes over an already existing and functioning society, they try to give people living in that society some measure of continuity in their daily lives. So, for example, when the Persian Empire took over a territory, they would allow people to continue practicing their religion, to keep their language, to keep their culture, and they used the systems of government that were already put into place. So, the everyday lives of the people didn't necessarily change dramatically. It's really one ruler being replaced by another. When the Spanish conquered the Incas and the Aztecs, they really went about destroying the existing civilizations and building brand new civilizations. So, culturally, they tried to model them on Europe in terms of language and belief systems with Catholicism. But these colonies in America served a very specific economic function, and they existed really to provide resources and wealth for Spain. And in the Spanish colonies, this wealth was created through agriculture and mining, specifically the mining of silver. The Spanish colonies in America were a mix of indigenous people and Spanish settlers, and a clearly defined class structure emerged. The most well off people on the colony were the Spanish settlers, and the settlers didn't do a lot of the manual labor. They were mostly government officials and tax collectors, work supervisors. Directly underneath the Spanish was the mixed race population, and these were the children that were born out of relationships between Spanish men and indigenous women. So there were roughly 7 Spanish men for every Spanish woman on the colony. So there was a lot of blending between Spanish and indigenous people. The most well-off people on the colony were the Spanish settlers, and the settlers didn't do a lot of the manual labor. They were mostly government officials, tax collectors, and supervisors. Now, underneath the Spanish was the mixed race population, and these people go by the name mestizos. And these were the children born out of relationships between Spanish men and indigenous women. So there were roughly 7 Spanish men for every Spanish woman on the colony. So there's a lot of blending taking place between the Spanish settlers and the indigenous people. For indigenous women, marrying a Spanish man wasn't necessarily such a bad thing because it meant they would have a chance to live a better life, or at least a more privileged life, and the children would have more opportunities. From a cultural standpoint, the mestizos and mestizas were more Spanish in their culture than indigenous. But there was still a lot of racism in the colony. These people that were Spanish often looked down on the mestizos and mestizas and openly regarded them as being inferior. But they occupied a lot of sort of the middle positions in society. A lot were artisans and craftspeople, supervisors, and some low-level government officials. The people that had it the hardest on the Spanish colonies were the indigenous people, and they were referred to as Indians. They were essentially forced to work for the Spanish on large farms or in mines, specifically silver mines. The people that had it the hardest on the Spanish colonies were the indigenous people, and they were referred to as Indians on the colony. They were essentially forced to work for the Spanish on large farms or in mines. So these people, they suffered from epidemic diseases, they were forced to pay heavy taxes, and their traditional belief systems, traditional religions, were attacked by Spanish Catholic missionaries. Although, to the credit of the Spanish missionaries, they also became advocates for the indigenous people against the abuse by the colonial government. So today, Spanish is the first language of most of Latin America, and the notable exception is Brazil, which is the biggest, most populated country in Latin America. In Brazil, people speak Portuguese instead of Spanish because Brazil was a colony of Portugal. So, the Spanish were the first Europeans to come to America, and they concentrated on conquering what they saw as the wealthiest areas of America. This was Mesoamerica and the Andes, the land of the Aztecs and the Incas. The next European power to set up shop was Portugal, and they set up colonies in the lowland areas of coastal Brazil. And this area wasn't as rich in natural resources as Mesoamerica or the Andes, but the Portuguese found this land was very good for the production of sugar, and this made a lot of money for Brazil. Other European powers sort of copied the Portuguese idea and established their own American colonies, mostly in the Caribbean, and turned these lands into massive sugar plantations. The sugar plantation colonies weren't self-sufficient. The purpose of the colony was really just to grow sugar. They didn't grow their own food. Everything had to be imported. So the sugar plantations started with Portugal and Brazil, but Spain, Britain, France, and the Netherlands all took colonies in the Caribbean and created their own sugar plantations. In Brazil and the Caribbean, it was much harder to find indigenous people to do the hard work. These areas were much less populated than the Inca and Aztec heartlands, and the indigenous populations had collapsed with the arrival of Europeans. So, talked about epidemic diseases. Most of the survivors from the epidemics fled into the interior of the continent. So there wasn't really a ready supply of lots of labor, the amount of labor required to run a sugar plantation. So because there was a shortage of indigenous people to work, these colonies relied on importing slaves. And they imported slaves from Africa. And we're going to look at the Atlantic slave trade in more detail next week, but now is a good time to start talking about it. European colonies imported slaves from Africa to work on plantations. 80% of these slaves ended up in colonies in Brazil and the Caribbean, most of them involved in some way with the sugar plantations. By all accounts, conditions on the sugar plantations were absolutely horrible, even worse than the mines in the Spanish colonies. The average lifespan of a person brought over from Africa as a slave was only 7 years. So these colonies were constantly importing new slaves. What this meant in terms of ethnicity and cultural identity of the regions is it created a different cultural ethnic makeup than the Spanish colonies on mainland America. So by the 1800s, the majority of Brazil and the Caribbean was of African descent. So Haiti, for example, was almost completely African. A similar social hierarchy emerged in the sugar plantations, with Europeans being the most privileged people, and they were followed by children of mixed race relationships. In Brazil, children of mixed Portuguese and African descent were known as mulattoes, and mulattoes occupied sort of middle class, somewhat similar to the mestizos in the Spanish colonies. At the bottom of the social hierarchy were slaves. Some slaves were indigenous people, but the majority of slaves were imported from Africa. So Great Britain took this plantation model and they brought it over to the southern United States. Now, the southern United States wasn't suitable for sugar production. Instead, what they built were cotton and tobacco plantations. In the southern U.S., there's less blending of races because more European women went to the southern United States. Because of this, there's less blending, there was more racism, less tolerance for mixed race relationships, and a social hierarchy emerged here really based just on color. The language that was used were white Europeans, red Indians, and black slaves. Great Britain also established colonies in what are now the northeastern United States in places like New England, New York, and Pennsylvania. These were really settler-driven colonies, people wanting to leave Britain and start a new life in America, and they were much less focused on large-scale production. They were really small, independent farms. And finally, to the north, you have France establishing colonies in what is now eastern Canada, so colonies like New France and Acadia, and France exploited these colonies for valuable resources, beginning with cod, and then moving on to timber, and especially beaver pelts. So while Europeans were building up their global empires in the Americas, Other big regional empires were popping up in the Eastern Hemisphere. So it's during the early modern era that the boundaries of modern day Russia, China, and India really take form. And we also see the last days of the Byzantine Empire before it falls to the rule of Islamic Ottomans. So, starting with Russia, you want to know that between the years 1500 and 1800, the Russian state expanded from its heartland in Moscow and spread west, south, and east throughout Eurasia, and it established basically the boundaries of modern day Russia. To the south and the east, the people who were conquered by the Russians were mostly hunter gatherers and pastoral nomads. Like Europeans in America, Russians tried to convert these people to Christianity, Orthodox Christianity, not Catholicism. Also, like Europeans in America, Russians spread disease to conquered people, especially people living in the more remote areas like Siberia. These people, like the indigenous Americans, had no immunity to diseases like measles and smallpox. But the biggest impact the Russians had on conquered people to the east and south was that when settlers came and put down farms, it really disrupted traditional migration routes for hunter gatherers and destroyed pasture land for pastoral nomads. Over time, the nomads in these areas became farmers and assimilated into Russian culture. So, like in America, there was a lot of blending of ethnicities, but there weren't officially recognized mixed race groups. So, in America, you have the mestizos, the mulattoes, later the Métis. In the Russian Empire, people more or less became Russian. Most adopted the Russian language and converted to Christianity. During this period, the Russian Empire also moved west and conquered territory. So the empire took on really still a multicultural identity with the adding of Ukrainians and Poles and Belarusians. The lands that Russia conquered, previous empires never really bothered conquering them because they seemed like they didn't have a lot to offer. They were sparsely populated. The belief was there wasn't a lot of wealth there. But they ended up creating a lot of wealth for Russia, and this wealth came from farming, came from the trading of furs, and it came from mining. With this newfound wealth, Russia would become a major player on the global stage, both a European power and an Asian power. So this is the end of episode 17, Empires and Encounters. Thank you for listening.